Old Testament lesson 32. I know that my Redeemer liveth. Today we're going to be talking about the book of Job. Now, over the last couple of weeks while I was preparing this lesson, I had a conversation with a few different people, and they asked me what my lesson was on, and I mentioned it was Job, and they said, "Oh, I don't like Job." And I was kind of surprised to learn how many people actually don't like Job. So if you're one of those people who don't like it, please um, try to stay with me. Hopefully we can make it a little bit more interesting, and maybe we'll all learn a thing or two about it. When we look at the Old Testament structure, the Old Testament's broken up into a couple different sections. The Pentateuch, or also known as the Law, the first 5 books of Moses lays out the Law of Moses. And then the history books, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, etc. Just outlining the history of Israel, the formulation of Israel, that kind of thing. Then we have wisdom literature, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Songs of Solomon, and then we go into the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc. So wisdom literature, when we think about the Old Testament, and we think about the stories that we know from the Old Testament, or the people that we know from the Old Testament, I would venture to guess that the majority of those stories, the majority of those people, are from times when Israel was in some sort of crisis. They're, up to battle against somebody, David and Goliath, the Assyrians, um, or, the person that we know as a prophet who's up there booming, "Thus saith the Lord," and um, trying to call the Israelites to repentance because something bad is going on. But when you look at it chronologically, there's big sections of the Old Testament where there's no real crisis. People are just living their lives. They're just, trying to make ends meet day to day, get through their life, raise their kids, that kind of thing. And that's what this wisdom literature is for. It's for those times when, there is no big crisis. There's no prophet booming, "Thus saith the Lord." There's just people trying to deal with the normal problems of life. And we get 2 weeks of this, more or less, in the Gospel Doctrine lesson manual. Last week was Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. This week will be Job. So Proverbs, I think, is probably one of the most well-known books in the Old Testament. It offers insights on a wide range of subjects. A lot of people know Proverbs, or at least, one or two of the Proverbs. It shows us that the wisdom of God can guide us through our lives. It demonstrates that anyone can make an incredible life for themselves through the gifts that God's wisdom freely offers, as long as they respect the source for that wisdom. But what about when bad things happen, even to people who follow God's wisdom? Well, that's kind of addressed a little bit in the other book that was discussed last week, Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes explores 3 main things, all of which attempt to show that this life as we know it and live it is basically meaningless. The first theme is that time marches on. There's a constant march of time. Nothing we can do about it. The second theme is that we're all going to die. Everybody will eventually die. And the third is life's random nature. Sometimes you follow Proverbs wisdom and nothing happens. Nothing good happens. You have a hard life. You have trials. Sometimes you look at another one who's a fool, who doesn't follow that wisdom, and yet they're prospering. Or an evil person prospers. Life is somewhat random. And since we cannot control our lives fully, we must enjoy them as they are and be content with the blessings God has given us. The truths, though, presented in Ecclesiastes, when you really sit and think about them and get all philosophical and dive deep, can leave you wondering if God himself is wise and just. And that is the question that is explored in the book of wisdom literature we will discuss today. Job, the book of Job. Now, Job is kind of like a sandwich. It starts with prose, ends with prose, and the meat in the middle is poetry. So the prologue at the beginning, the first couple of chapters, is a prose narrative. It's the story of Job, how righteous he is, how wealthy he is, his misfortunes, some of the conversations that are happening in heaven at this time as Job is going through his trials. And then we move into the poetry section, the largest section of the book, We see a dialogue between Job and three of his friends. We have a fourth friend, assumed friend, come in and give some speeches. And then there's dialogue between God and Job. And then there's a quick epilogue at the end. It's 10 verses long. It's the story of Job's restoration. So that's the main outline of the book of Job. Now, Job is widely agreed to be the most difficult book to translate in the entire Old Testament. Because, and not the the prose sections at the couple chapters at the beginning and the last 10 verses are fairly straightforward. It's the poetry section that's killer. In one article I was reading, even called it a minefield. It has a very high concentration of words that appear only once in the Hebrew and nowhere else. So as the translators are translating the Bible, they look at a word and look at all of the times that it is used, and they try to glean from all of those different times, the context in each of those times, the best meaning to translate into the new language. So if a word is only used once, then it can sometimes be not very clear what its meaning is, and they have to kind of guess just from that immediate context around it. And so that can be a problem. And so it's very difficult to translate Job. Now, Bible research and knowledge has come a long way in the last couple hundred years. And so you'll notice that new translations of Job can be quite different from older ones. And the King James Version, simply by nature of its age, likely misrepresents the Hebrew in many places in Job, even in some doctrinal spots. Now, we won't really dive too deep into this, but there is one thing I want to point out. You know, at the beginning of Job, it says that he was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. And then we see Satan come in, right? And Satan is allowed to take away everything Job has, all his material possessions, his family, his flocks, his property, but not allowed to touch his health. And then eventually, when Job is still, seen as righteous, then Satan is allowed to take away his health. And so Job is in a terrible spot on the street, poor health, nothing to his name. But the Satan in this story is not a proper name. It's not Satan with a capital S like it's rendered in the King James Version. The evil one the star that fell from heaven and leads all the bad guys and lives in hell or whatever. Satan in Hebrew, the word Satan, is a descriptive noun. It describes any person that stands opposed to or as an adversary to someone else. And we see it in use in other places in the Old Testament. For instance, when King Solomon's kingdom is being invaded, Hadad the Edomite and Rezon the son of Eliada are both called in Hebrew a Satan. But it's not just bad guys that are called Satan. King David is called a Satan by the Philistines. And it's not just mortals, because you'll remember Balaam and his donkey, and then there's the angel of the Lord, where that angel of the Lord who opposed Balaam is described as a Satan. So even an angelic messenger representing the will and authority of God can take on the function of a Satan. I think that's what we're seeing here in Job. In Job, the Satan is not God's adversary. He's not the devil, but it's Job's adversary. He acts as one of God's subordinates and follows his directives. So when God presents Job as a stellar example of human virtue and piety, the Satan raises the possibility that maybe Job's good behavior could be explained in a very different way. He claims Job's virtuous behavior is motivated by selfishness. He says, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land." Right? The Satan challenges God's policy of rewarding the righteous by suggesting that it corrupts their motives and proves them to be less righteous. If people know that if they're righteous, they're blessed materially, then pretty soon they're going to be righteous for selfish reasons. They're going to want to be blessed materially. They're going to want the most flocks. They're going to want to be the wealthiest guy around like Job is. That's why he's righteous, because he's getting all these blessings from being righteous. He's not being righteous for righteousness' sake. So while we might be inclined to ask why righteous people suffer, the Satan turns this question around and says, why do righteous people prosper? So the book of Job is Israelite wisdom literature, and its message isn't that Satan and God make bets and leave innocent people's fates hanging in the balance. It is simply calling into question whether God should reward all good deeds and punish all bad ones. John Walton, a scholar in the Bible, wrote a book on Job, very insightful, but he says, as I have taught Job to students over the years, the question frequently arises, what sort of God is this who uses his faithful ones as pawns in bets with the devil? I would suggest that this question is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the prologue. The scene in heaven, like the speeches of Job's friends, is part of the literary design of a thought experiment to generate discussion about how God runs the cosmos. The message of the book is offered at the end, in the speeches of God, not in the opening scenario, which only sets up the thought experiment. So if you think about it, the Satan only appears in the prologue, in the first couple of chapters. We got a book that's over 40 chapters long. This guy is a character at the very beginning. He kind of asks the questions, sets the stage, and then he's gone. We don't see him anymore because that's not what we're supposed to be focused on in this book. That's not where the message, the lesson to be learned is found. It's not in the prologue. It's at the end, and we'll get to the end in a little bit. So we're going to pick up the story here. Job has lost everything. He's sitting on the street. He's in poor health. He doesn't have anything to his name, and he has some friends that show up, and they start talking about his situation. Now, Jewish scholar Masyahu Savat proposed that the book is exploring three claims made about God and Job, but that only two can be true at the same time. Claim number one is that God is just and good. God's character compels him to always act justly for the good of others. Claim number two is the retribution principle. God has ordered the world so that good deeds are rewarded and evil deeds are punished. Number three is that Job is innocent. Job has done nothing to deserve his suffering. Now, Job's friends, they argue that number one is true, God is just and good, by which they mean that number two is true, the retribution principle, right? God has ordered the moral universe to run by the retribution principle so that good deeds are rewarded and evil deeds are punished. And if both of those are true, then the only conclusion that Job's friends can come to is that Job's suffering must be the result of some evil that he's done for which he is being punished. Now, Job, on the other hand, is adamant that number three is true. He has done nothing wrong. He's innocent. And he does not deserve this suffering as a punishment because he hasn't done anything. But Job also believes that number two is true, that God runs the world by means of retribution. Good things are rewarded, bad things are punished. And so, from Job's perspective, if number three is true and number two is true, then that's not a good place to be, because then number one can't be true. If both of those are true, maybe God is not just or good, or even worse, maybe God is incompetent at running the universe. And that's where Job is at, and he's struggling with this. And Job and his friends continue their circular arguments for 24 chapters. The bulk of the book is these guys going around and around in circles, never really coming to any resolution about their debate. And then we have Elihu, assuming a fourth of Job's friends, show up, and he puts everybody in their place. He tells his friends that you can't condemn Job without any evidence, and you're not his judges anyways. And he turns to Job and he says, "You're trying to justify yourself. You're not justifying God." And he kind of kills the conversation, I guess you could say. And so Job is left just confused, and he's at the end of his rope, and he laments the days of his past when his body was healthy and his life filled with family and friends, and he decides he can no longer endure his present suffering, so he demands that God provide an explanation for what's going on. And then here is where God enters the story. God comes down to talk. Well, I don't know if he comes down, but God talks to Job. And he doesn't come down and just start answering his questions. he starts asking questions. He says, all right, Job, you think I'm asleep at the wheel here? You think that you're innocent and yet you're suffering, so I must be doing something wrong? Well, let me ask you, Job, have you, um, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? We don't get an answer from Job in the Bible text. And so God goes on to another question. Okay, Job, have you ever in your days commanded the morning light? Again, no answer from Job. All right, well, where does the light live? Or where does the darkness reside? Job, do you know that answer? No? Well, Job, can you lead out the constellation in its season? Do you control the stars? No, you don't do that either, huh? There's no answers from Job on any of these. Job is silent while God is asking him these questions about the universe, the order of the universe, how the universe runs. And so then God brings it a little bit closer to home. God starts asking Job about the world that he lives in. Okay, Job, you can't answer my questions about the universe. Maybe you can at least answer my questions about the world that you live in. Can you, Job, send lightning or rain? No, can't do that. Well, how about maybe you provide the food for the lions? Do you do that, Job? No, you don't do that either. Well, the baby ravens in their nests. Do you feed the ravens? They're hungry. They need to eat to survive. Have you fed the ravens in their nests? Maybe you've gone up into the mountains and you've delivered a baby mountain goat. Have you ever done that? Haven't done that. Okay, Job. Well, have you given peacocks their beautiful feathers? Haven't done that either, huh? Well, ostriches, they just lay their eggs in the ground and then cover them with dirt and walk away. Do you protect those eggs? Do you make sure that nothing steps on them and crushes them and kills them? Who protects the eggs of the ostriches, Job? Is it you? Not you, huh? Well, can you talk to me about how eagles fly, the aerodynamics of their wings and their feathers? Or maybe how they hunt, how they can see so far, and how they hunt and catch prey. No, you can't do that either? Well, God is asking Job all of these questions, and eventually Job just blurts out, behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. Once I have spoken, and I will not answer. Even twice, and I will add nothing more. So Job is all caught up in himself, in his own problems, his own trials. And he is so frustrated with what's going on in his life that he demands God come down and give him an answer. And God just comes down and asks him questions about, well, Job, do you run the universe? Do you run the world that you're in? The world is a bigger place than just you, Job. The universe is a much, much bigger place than just you, Job. And this is where Job is a little bit humbled and says, I am insignificant. I stuck my foot in my mouth. I get it. I was caught up in my own problems. I'm just going to put my hand over my mouth. I'm not going to say anything more. I'm just making myself look foolish. Stephen Tanner, a professor at BYU, said, Job demanded reasons and arguments and proofs from his friends and from God, but was reconciled in his faith not because he received those answers, quite the contrary. The Lord, rather than answering his questions, overwhelmed him with additional ones, even more perplexing. His final confession of faith resulted not from knowledge based on discursive logic, but from a direct inner personal encounter with the Lord. So Job, being all caught up in his own life, his own problems, his own trials, was asking questions about him. He was focused 100% on himself. And the Lord did not answer those questions, but turned it around and asked Job questions that helped him realize that this world is a bigger place than just Job. This universe is a bigger place than just Job. And so he's reconciled in his faith because of his encounter with the Lord, not because of his answer to his questions. So then we have God going on, and he invites Job to rule the universe. He says, deck thyself now with majesty and excellency, and array thyself with glory and beauty. Cast abroad the rage of thy wrath, and behold everyone that is proud, and abase him. Look on everyone that is proud, and bring him low, and tread down the wicked in their place. Okay, Job, you can't answer any questions about the universe, the cosmos. You can't answer any questions even about the world you live on. Why don't you come try to sit on my throne? You're a pretty upset guy. You've got a lot of wrath and rage. Why don't you cast that about on all those proud people, all those people that have their material possessions still and you don't have yours, right? While the strict principle of retribution to reward every good deed and punish every bad one sounds good in theory, in execution, it would create a universe where no human would ever have a chance for trial and error, or, more importantly, for growth and change. If if this retribution principle that Job believed to be true, every good deed is rewarded, every bad deed is punished, then how could we ever do anything? If every time we make even the slightest mistake, we're punished, right? Job is given the opportunity. Why don't you sit on my throne, Job? You see all these proud people, they still have their material possessions, but they make mistakes. Why don't you use that retribution principle, see how well that works for you? And then God does something interesting. He kind of goes back to the earth that Job lives on, and he brings up two fierce predators, Behemoth, which is a land animal, and Leviathan, which are a sea creature. Now, we don't really know what those are. There's a lot of, over the couple thousand years since this was written, there's a lot of myth that's kind of been intermingled with these words, and maybe there was at this time too. But what we do know was Behemoth was a big, fierce, scary, man-eating land animal, and Leviathan was a big, fierce, scary, ship-eating, fisherman-killing sea creature. So God brings up Behemoth and Leviathan, and he asks Job if he could domesticate them or even catch those animals. But without even, it appears, giving Job time to answer, God says, don't do it. Can you domesticate these or catch them? Well, I would recommend you don't, Job. I would recommend you stay away from them entirely because they would maim or kill you without giving it a second thought. So why does God do that? God even then goes on to say that he loves Behemoth and Leviathan. They're part of his creation. But why would God bring up these animals that he created, that he loves, but that would kill or maim a human if the human gets too close? Well, God made this world and everything in it. And God's trying to tell Job, there's Leviathans out there. There's Behemoths out there. One day you may actually run into one, and it might wreak havoc on your life. It might maim you, it might kill you. But just because that happens, you can't conclude that God is punishing you or that maybe the creature is evil, because neither is the case. This creature is one of God's creation and he loves it. But yet, if it maims you, that's not God punishing you. That's not a punishment for a sin that you did. That's just simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So, lesson learned there, right? Going back to John Walton, he says, God's answer to Job does not explain why righteous people suffer, because the cosmos is not designed to prevent righteous people from suffering. Job questioned God's design, and God responded that Job had insufficient knowledge to do so. Job questioned God's justice, and God responded that Job needs to trust him, and that he should not arrogantly think that God can be domesticated to conform to Job's feeble perceptions of how the cosmos should run. God asks for trust, not understanding, and states that the cosmos is founded on his wisdom, not his justice. So after this dialogue between God and Job, we have the epilogue, where God tells Job his friends were wrong. Their ideas of God's justice were too simple, and not true to the complexity of the world or the complexity of God's wisdom. But then he goes on to tell Job he approves of his wrestling, how he approached God honestly with all of his emotion, only wanting to talk to God himself. That's the right way, God says, to process through these issues, is through the struggle of prayer. Think about it, struggle, and then go straight to God with, in all honesty, with your emotion, go straight to God. Get your answers, or maybe non-answers, from God. The book concludes with Job having his health, family, and wealth all restored, not as a reward for good behavior, but simply as a generous gift from God. And just like a fairy tale ending, Job lives happily ever after. So the few key takeaways, remember at the beginning we said the key takeaways from this come at the end. The first one is humility. Job was very prideful. He was stuck on himself, his problems. Me, me, me. I'm having all these problems. And Job challenged God's justice. And God responded that Job didn't have sufficient knowledge about our complex universe to make such a claim. Job demanded a full explanation from God, and what God asked from Job is his trust in his wisdom and character. And then Job responded with humility and repentance. So here Job is all caught up. All he can think about is his own life, how he's lost everything, how hard his life is, how bad things are for him. It's all about Job. And Job wants to know why God did it. God, why is this happening to me? God, why did you let this happen? God, why did you do this to me? God says, Job, first off, God helps Job see the bigger picture. And then he says, Job, just trust in my wisdom and my character. And then Job apologizes for accusing God of injustice and acknowledges that he's overstepped his bounds. So the moral of the story here is that human pain and suffering does not always happen as a clear consequence of anyone's sin. There might be a reason for the pain and the suffering, but there might not be. Maybe you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a Leviathan got you, or a behemoth got you. Doesn't mean you sinned. Doesn't mean anything other than you were there and the behemoth got you. The world is full of order and beauty, but it's also wild and sometimes dangerous. And that's why the behemoths, the Leviathans, stay away from them. So why is there suffering in the world? God doesn't explain why. We live in a complex, amazing world that is not designed to prevent suffering. So the book of Job doesn't unlock the secret of why bad things happen to good people. Instead, it invites us to trust God's wisdom when we encounter suffering rather than trying to figure out the reasons for it. If we try to put a reason on it, when we search for a reason, we tend to either simplify God like the friends or accuse God based on limited evidence like Job, right? If we look for a reason for our suffering, we're either going to do one of two things. We're either going to blame God. God, why are you letting this happen to me? God, this is all your fault. Or we're going to blame ourselves. Oh, I'm a sinner. Oh, I'm being punished. Oh, I'm such a bad person. I'm such a loser. But we shouldn't be blaming God. We shouldn't be blaming ourselves. We should be trusting God. The book of Job invites us to honestly bring our pain and our grief to God, realizing that he cares and trusting that he knows exactly what he's doing. Thank you.